This is Farthest Frontier. It's a realistic medieval colony management / city builder game. If you've ever played Banished and thought, wow, this is great, I want more, then you're in the right place. Farthest Frontier is basically just a better version of Banished, in every way. And it's not abandoned. Farthest Frontier starts off like a lot of colony sims do. You start with a handful of villages, and you have to build up your settlement from the ground up. The game has a few rough pointers to help you progress, but for the most part you're on your own. The game does a really good job in steering you in the direction of realism. For example, in any colony management game, you might think to just find the type of food that is the easiest to mass produce and make nothing else. But in Farthest Frontier, you can't do that. If you feed your people like pirates, they're gonna get scurvy like pirates. Another way Farthest Frontier steers you in the direction of realism is with the desirability stat. Naturally, people don't like living near dung collectors and factories, but they wouldn't mind waking up each morning to the smell of baking bread or the sweet roses of a nearby garden. Basically, houses do better when they have access to better services and pretty parks, and worse when there is big industry close by. This encourages the player to build residential and industrial areas separately. Farthest Frontier is realistic in a lot of ways, and the one that stands out probably made some people exit the game entirely. It's the farming system. Most games would just have you choose a plot of land and plant some seeds, but not Farthest Frontier. Oh no, just look at this. You have a 3-year crop rotation, weed levels, pebbliness, fertility levels, soil composition, and each crop has like 10 stats. They definitely consulted someone with an agricultural degree for this. But you might ask why. Why is there this level of soil management in the game? And, well, I think the answer is because it complements the rest of the experience by adding to the gameplay loop. See, a lot of city builders run into the following issue. You build up your little colony and you queue up some orders and then just kind of let it run for a bit on the max speed. And then you go on Reddit on your phone. Games like this need something to take up the player's attention during periods where the player's just waiting for their settlement to develop. Downtime. And the soil management helps with this. It adds to a list of things to check up on, and it's very rewarding once you get the hang of it. Furthermore, a colony management game that doesn't emphasize combat should have complicated non-combat systems. And graphs. It should have lots and lots of graphs. I mean, just look at this. There's a graph for everything. Knowing how to read these spreadsheets is going to make the difference between your town surviving the winter and having 8,000 surplus candles. It's not exactly a super readable UI, but there's a lot of information here. I don't think there's an easy way to display it. At least you have your most vital resources at the top of the screen. Speaking about UI, I can't tell you what a big difference this little number here makes. In a lot of colony sim games, like Banished, you get told how much food you have left in raw numbers. I don't know about you, but I don't know the average potato consumption of a human being per month. Farthest Frontier just tells you how many months of food you have left, and how much is going to spoil. It makes the calculation for you, so you don't have to guess. A difference like this is so simple, but so helpful. Farthest Frontier is very similar to the Anno series in a lot of ways, particularly the progression system. Like Anno, you advance by improving the lives of your villagers through giving them access to better goods and services. It's a lot more realistic though, you can't just live off fish. Because, like I said, scurvy is a thing. Your villagers want a variation in their food, and they also want things like pottery, clothing, access to a market, etc. No church though, which, now that I think of it, might be intentional. Anyway, it's a standard progression system, but with some realistic additions. Poop collectors, for example, an essential medieval job, which can then be used for fertilizer. Very cool. Water is on the list too. You can't have towns without wells. There's also a lot of non-essential consumables, like shoes and tools, that improve the efficiency of your workers. Having a basic education also helps with that. You can't grow crops if you don't know how to count. While you're progressing through Farthest Frontier, ultimately, your biggest threat is yourself. If you try to scale up your town too quickly, you'll hit the hardest wall in the game. Starvation and exposure. The simplest resources are the most important. Food and firewood. Scaling too quickly is also dangerous because it takes time for food-producing buildings to become active, especially the labor-intensive crop fields. This is a staple of games in this genre. Planning ahead is always key. I can tell that Farthest Frontier is a really well-made game, because the biggest issue I had with it was the foliage. And that's not clever review slang for something, like I'm talking about the in-game foliage. It's really awful. They have some anti-aliasing going, but I really don't think the plants are meant to be this jagged. At first I just turned it off in the settings, but then figured out that if you just take the super sampling up or down 5%, it kind of fixes it. I don't know what's going on here, but I highly recommend doing that. My second biggest gripe with Farthest Frontier is that I just wanted more. The game is in early access and has a lot of cool content, but I can see this game going to the moon. Not literally, I think the time period is fine. But I could imagine that there could be a few more upgrades and tiers for your buildings. The devs have mentioned that they are working on that. My wild thought on this was an expansion on the mining system. The farming is really fleshed out, so maybe the mining can be too. Anyway, let's talk about the combat. Like I said, the combat section of Farthest Frontier isn't really the emphasis of the game, but it does do a good job in its simple design. I think the only issue is that the player is quite limited in how they deal with threats. The predatory animals are fine, they're somewhat intelligent, and they don't just beeline for your town center. They attack your buildings until food comes out. They also attack your villages until food comes out of them. They're the early game threat, and the best way to deal with them is selecting as many villages as possible and just going and punching the poor things to death. It's a bit silly. The raiders are the mid to late game threat, and they're similarly intelligent. They do as their name implies. They raid. They look for your most valuable stockpiled goods and try to take as much of it as they can and scurry away. There is a few different variations of them, which is nice. In the late game they even come with battering rams. Very organized. However, dealing with them can be a bit annoying. Controlling your own forces is a little unintuitive. You kind of just have to garrison the town center and tell your barracks troops where to wait for the enemies. It's not great, but I guess it does the trick. Anno also had similar problems in figuring out what's the best way to do land combat in a city builder. I think the game could benefit from having some kind of militia system where you can arm your peasants with weapons for basic defense, as opposed to just garrisoning the TC and shooting arrows out like Age of Empires. I think that could be a lot more realistic than, well, this. I do like the varying levels of equipment you can give your defensive forces though. It's not just weapons, but rather 3 tiers of weapons, 3 types of armor, shields, and a bunch more. You never have to individually manage who gets what, your soldiers just auto-equip what's best. All in all, the combat is just fine. It could use some work, but it's not the focus of the game. I do have to give credit where credit is due though. Farthest Frontier is a really pretty game. Pretty in the way a mountain is. You know, it's covered in dirt and grit and probably a bit of animal poo, but man, it just looks beautiful. When you have your town all set up and going, it looks like a real medieval settlement. I mean, just look at the farms. The devs took the time and effort to add little boundary trees and shrubs, and it looks great. Even the little industrial buildings look so good in their place, and they blend in to make a little believable industrial area. Sometimes they blend in a bit too well though, and it can be difficult to find them, like really difficult. Like, I know I have 2 cobbler's shops around here, but I just can't fucking find them. The only thing that sticks out are the walls. They went for a grid system for them, and they can look a bit blocky. The roads can curve and bend in very natural ways, and I think it would be cool if the walls could do the same. In terms of replayability, I've gotten a few playthroughs out of Farthest Frontier so far. There's a couple of different map types and difficulties to try out. On my hardest playthrough on the hardest map, I had a great time. Constant raids had me really focusing on defense. The rough terrain forced me to plan every part of expanding my city. Oh, and I straight up didn't have access to basic resources, so I had to buy all the clay from every single passing trader. That takes me onto the in-game trading system. I think it's fine in the state it is, but man, food is hellishly expensive. To realistically buy a practical amount of food will cost your entire city its GDP. Also, there seems to be a bit of a discrepancy between how much money you make through tax and how much things cost. A small town of 100 people will earn enough money in a year to buy 1 unit of weapons. Meanwhile, selling 10 units of pottery will get you the same thing. It makes trading very much essential in any playthrough. In terms of the soundtrack, there isn't much to talk about. City builders don't really have to rely on their sounds and music all that much. They just need a few calm tracks. The one part of the audio design that I really did enjoy was the sounds all the buildings make when you click on them. They're so descriptive and distinct. Just have a listen. My personal favorite? The Ratcatcher. Brutal. I genuinely enjoyed Farthest Frontier. It's a really competent city builder with quite a lot to offer. It's done its best to differentiate itself from games in the genre with its realism. And it's got the makings of a really fleshed out experience. It's not without its bugs, but I think the game is definitely worth your time. Thanks for watching.